Welcome back to Straight Talk Africa, live from Washington. Once again, it's time to bring in my colleague and social media reporter, Mariama Diaro. Take it away again, Mariama.
Well, thanks, Shaka. Despite being home to several of the world's worst performing countries in terms of respect for human rights, Africa saw uneven progress toward democratization during the 1990s and the early 2000s, with many developing nations on the continent struggling for democracy, not supporting freedom of the press. For instance, while elections are being held in the Gambia and Ethiopia, the media in these countries is often restricted or controlled by the government in a form of censorship. In fact, some analysts say press freedom does not guarantee honest elections, but it helps those in power to justify the event. This brings us to our question of the week, which asks, is it possible to have good governance and democracy without an independent and free media? Well, we'll go right to your answers and begin with Solomon Ricky King, who wrote to us from Katanga in the Democratic Republic of Congo. He says, democracy means no government interruption in people's views about it. Therefore, there must be an independent media in order to have democracy and good governance. Another comment comes from Paul Nganga in Kenya, who posted his opinion on our wall saying, media freedom should be ensured, but there is nothing like absolute freedom. Checks and balances must be there. Shaka, right on the point from Paul, because many times people forget that checks and balances are indeed the basis for any good journalist. But what about the part that there is no such thing as absolute freedom?
Well, absolute freedom indeed, there's no such a thing. It is merely an ideal, but freedom has to be relative. What about you, Taylor? Is it necessary, is it a prerequisite that in order for you to be a free society, a democratic society, you must have a free media?
Thanks so much, Shaka, for having me here today. As I was driving past the Jefferson Memorial just to get here to the studios here in Washington, I was reminded of one of the quotes from Jefferson, who says, if he had to choose between government and newspaper, or newspaper and government, he would prefer the latter, provided that the population could read the newspaper.
I remember that.
And he continues on later to talk about how where there is a thriving press, no society would be unsafe. So I think absolutely that the press provides a check on government, and it's absolutely necessary. And when you have destabilized democracy, you have a destabilized government as well, and a destabilized state. And in failed state situations, we know where that leads.
What about you, my brother Ofono Opondo? How do you react to that?
Well, obviously we need a free media in order to have good and vibrant democracy, but that free media ought to work within the rules of the country where they work. And the rules obviously have to be fair. The rules have to be enacted in a transparent way. Now, I think the media operates in the public space. If you operate in the public space, you are just like Parliament, you are like the executive, you are like the judiciary. So you ought to work within the rules that are fair, that have been enacted by a democratic platform like the Parliament of many countries around the world.
I see.
Unfortunately, in my view, many people who are journalists, who are in the media, tend to think that they should be excluded from abiding by the rules.
Does that also perhaps mean that a government is free to use the law to undermine democracy, to undermine justice?
No. The government should not use the law to undermine democracy in any case. There are always appeal mechanisms if the government oversteps its boundaries. You can go to courts of law. At the very extreme end, when election time comes, you can change a bad government.
We'll come to you later when we talk, of course, about the bill, the important bill that has just passed in your parliament, which is the Public Order Management Bill. Mariama, what else are people saying about today's topic?
Well, Shaka, a lot. Too bad we only have time for a few comments, and we'll take a look at Charles Walker Dollar, a student at Nkumba University in Uganda, what he had to say, saying that governments that put restrictions on the media are the bad and despotic ones. The question to be asked should be, why would they, in this case the governments, put restrictions on the media if their governance is good? They do this to conceal their bad governance from the rest of the world. I have to add that we've also gotten a lot of reactions from Uganda about the new bill, Shaka, that you just mentioned, the new bill that just passed, that could probably take up a whole show by itself. But finally, we're going to look at another comment from Yebe Diallo from Port Kamsar in the Bokeh region in Guinea, who writes, "In my view, democracy goes with freedom of speech. Therefore, it is impossible to have democracy and good governance without an independent and free media." Shaka, two comments from Uganda and Guinea, both are adamant at the fact that there must be an independent media. It's almost a prerequisite for any country that wants to call itself democratic.
Muhammad, what about that? You must have been following. Is there such a thing, in fact, as an independent media?
I cannot hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Can you hear me?
Yes, loud and clear. Were you hearing me? Well,
cannot
I'm
hear
afraid
you.
that Muhammad cannot hear me right now. Let me come to you, Mr. Ambassador. You just had it. If in fact you are free, you are hardworking, and everybody, lives happily and thereafter, then why have these, someone might call them draconian restrictions on the operation of the media and the journalists? Why don't you look at journalists like us as your allies, as opposed to looking at us as your enemies, really?
Eritrea doesn't look journalists as enemies because we firmly believe that as a country that emanated from the struggle for human rights during the 30 years of national liberation struggle, in the nation building process, we believe that responsible media is very important for the country. People have been mentioning about its relationship with democracy. If there is to be responsible media, I think it should be related to essentially most important democracy element, which is there must be responsible participation of the people. Now in Eritrea, there is responsible participation of the people, and that's the biggest political asset that we have.
So you are talking,
That's why
you are talking about what countries like yours would say service delivery
no,
over freedoms.
no.
Yeah, because my question would have frankly been whether you think that service delivery, providing services to people, which is a good thing, and you are making some progress in some areas, in terms of, for example, reduction of poverty, mortality, reducing child mortality rates, and all sorts of things. Agriculture, I have not heard famine in your country, which is a good thing. But do you really think that service delivery and freedom of expression, for example, or freedoms are mutually exclusive, or are they mutually reinforcing, really?
I think the fallacy lies there. You can never have people participating, building their own future responsibly without expressing their idea, showing creativity, disseminating their own information. So this is the fallacy that exists in all the quarters that want to target Eritrea.
Welcome to that time is not a manifesto lie. There's no democracy, by the way, in this studio. When a producer says go, you have to go without asking questions. Thanks, Mariama, for bringing us this week's audience reaction.
I always like the part when you say that there is no democracy in this studio. I love that. Well, thanks, Shaka, and thanks all our viewers and listeners for taking the time to write to us and make their voices heard. We love hearing from you. So drop us a line at africatv@voanews.com. Once again, our email address is africatv@voanews.com. Or post your comment on our Facebook page. Just enter the keywords Straight Talk Africa. Be sure to visit us online at voaafrica.com Or you can join our YouTube channel. Then just subscribe to VOA TV to Africa. Now, let's take a look at what's on tap for next week's program. Next week on Straight Talk Africa, U.S. and African leaders met in the Ethiopian capital Addis Ababa this week to discuss the African Growth and Opportunity Act, also known as AGOA, which expires in 2 years. We'll discuss the pros, cons, and the future of the act next week, right here on Straight Talk Africa.